Detective Cameron Wilkes parked the squad car at the curb on Maple Street and turned off the engine. Through the windshield, he looked out the front window at an unassuming one-story house with peeling paint on the walls and a gnarled fence. 23 was no different from the neighbors. The same small lots, the same tattered mailboxes, the same old cars in the driveway. Just a working-class Blue Lake neighborhood where people struggled to make ends meet and rarely called the police. "What do we got?" Detective Jada Clark asked, slamming the passenger seat door shut. "Murder," Wilkes answered briefly, adjusting his tie and pulling a notebook from his inside jacket pocket. "Victim is Phoebe Monroe, 36 years old. Suspect is her husband Derek, 42. The call came in an hour ago from himself." Clark raised an eyebrow. In the 4 years she'd been paired with Wilkes, she was used to his restraint, but something in his voice told her the case promised to be unusual. They climbed the porch steps, passed the patrolman making notes in a notebook, and crossed the threshold. The house greeted them with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and something else, a metallic tang that experienced detectives recognized unmistakably. In the living room, a medium-sized black man sat on a worn couch. He held a smoking cigarette between his fingers and stared into the void in front of him. His hair was cut short, his hands were strong and calloused. He wore a warehouse worker's uniform, dark blue overalls with a patch on the chest. "Derek Monroe?" Wilkes showed his ID. "Detective Wilkes, this is Detective Clark. We'd like to talk to you." The man raised his head and nodded slowly. His gaze was calm, almost indifferent. "I killed her," he said without emotion. "Shot her right here in the kitchen. The gun is on the table." Clark glanced over at her partner. Usually suspects either denied everything, demanded a lawyer, or became hysterical. This calm confession alarmed her. "I see," Wilkes said evenly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Derek took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "She ate my burger, a double bacon cheeseburger from the fifth corner. I specifically asked her not to touch it. It was my dinner after my shift, and she went ahead and ate it." Clark frowned. She'd expected to hear about family problems, debt, infidelity, anything but that. "And you killed your wife over a burger?" she clarified. "Yes," Derek answered simply. Wilkes gestured his partner toward the kitchen. They left Derek in the care of the patrolman and walked through the narrow hallway. The kitchen was small and cramped. Phoebe Monroe lay on the linoleum near the refrigerator, a dark-skinned woman in jeans and a light blue t-shirt. Blood formed a dark puddle under her head. There was indeed a gun lying on the kitchen table, an old .38 caliber revolver. "Shot in the head at close range," Wilkes said quietly, examining the body without moving closer. "Gunpowder on the skin, so it was a close-range shot." Clark turned her attention to the trash can by the table. On top of it was a crumpled burger wrapper with the Fifth Corner Diner logo on it. "The wrapper's here," she said. Apparently she had actually eaten it. There were 2 plates on the table, one clean and one with crumbs on it. There was an empty Coca-Cola can and napkins next to it. It looked as if the woman had had a quiet dinner and then her husband had walked in and shot her in the head. Wilkes pulled out his cell phone and called forensics. Then they went back to the living room, where Derek was still sitting on the couch smoking his 3rd cigarette. "Derek," Wilkes sat down across from him, "tell me in detail what happened." "I got home at 7:30. My shift was over at 6, but I spent another half hour talking to the warehouse manager about tomorrow's deliveries. I went into the kitchen to warm up the burger I'd bought this morning. It's gone. I asked Phoebe, she said she ate it, said she was hungry and didn't want to wait. So what happened next? I took a gun out of the closet and shot her in the head. Once." Clark shook her head. The story sounded completely crazy, but the details matched what they'd seen at the crime scene. "Why do you have a gun in your house?" she asked. "I have a license. I was in the army in Afghanistan. I'm used to guns. I keep it for home defense." "Derek," Wilkes leaned forward, "do you realize you killed your wife over food? Does that seem okay to you?" The man shrugged. I warned her, told her many times, don't touch my food. We have rules in this house, and she knew them. What kind of rules? Different ones. I buy the food, I plan what we eat, and when we eat it. Phoebe wasn't supposed to take anything without permission. It's my house, my money, my rules. Wilkes and Clark looked at each other again. The picture was starting to become clear, and this wasn't just an impulsive killing over a burger. How long had you been married? Clark asked. 12 years. We got married when I got back from the army. And Phoebe always followed your rules? She used to. But lately, she's been doing whatever she wants. She'd go to the store without asking. She'd touch my food. I told her it was wrong, but she wouldn't listen. There was a knock at the door. Wilkes got up and opened it, and there were forensic officers with suitcases and a camera standing on the doorstep. Come in, he said. The body's in the kitchen. The gun is there too, on the table. While the CSIs worked, the detectives continued their conversation with Derek. He answered all the questions calmly and thoroughly, not trying to hide anything. He told them he worked as a loader in a building materials warehouse, receiving disability benefits for a leg injury. Phoebe worked at a dry cleaner's on the next street over. She was a good wife, he said. Cooked, cleaned, didn't mind my rules. But the last few months, something got to her. She got stubborn. What do you mean, stubborn? Well, she used to ask if she could buy something at the store. Now she decides for herself. Or with food, I always plan breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She started eating whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. Clark jotted down every word in her notebook. The story was getting more and more disturbing. Had you ever used physical force on your wife? She asked bluntly. Derek was silent for a moment, taking a drag on his cigarette. Sometimes I had to discipline her, but nothing serious. A slap, a shove. Women need to know who's boss. And how did Phoebe react to that kind of parenting? It varies. She used to apologize, promise not to do it again. But in recent months, she's been snapping at me. Said I had no right to control her. It's gotten to the point where it's gotten to the point where it's gotten to the point where it's gotten to the point. From the kitchen came the voices of the forensics team and the clicking of the camera. Wilkes realized that technically the case was simple. There was a killer who had confessed. There was a motive. There was evidence. But something told him that the story was far more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Wilkes and Clark had left Monroe's house while forensics were still working. Derek had been taken to the station for processing, and the detectives were to talk to the neighbors. Experience had taught them that people who lived nearby often knew more about a family than met the eye. The first person they decided to visit was the neighbor on the left, Tyrone Baker. The 39-year-old man opened the door before the detectives could knock. Apparently, he was watching from his window. "Is this about Phoebe?" he asked, wiping his hands with a rag. He was wearing jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt. I heard the gunshot. I knew right away something bad had happened. Tyrone Baker? Wilkes. We'd like to talk to you about the Monroe family. Sure, come on in. I'm sorry about the mess, but I'm working from home. They went into the small living room, where there were boxes of printed matter everywhere. Tyrone worked in a print shop and sometimes took orders home. Tell me what you know about Derek and Phoebe, Clark asked, settling into a chair. They've lived here for 10 years, Tyrone began, sitting down across from her. Derek was always the odd one out. Military, you know. He likes order to the point of mania. The grass in their yard is always perfectly cut, the car is always washed, even the trash cans line up perfectly. And as for their relationship, Phoebe was always quiet. She'd say hello if she met someone, but she never stopped to chat. And Derek never talked to anyone, only if it was business. Wilkes was jotting down highlights in his notebook. Did you hear any arguments between them? Tyrone hesitated, rubbing his chin. Not before, no. The house was always quiet. Even the TV was playing quietly. But about 3 or 4 months ago, I started hearing voices. Not yelling, but loud conversations. Derek was explaining something and Phoebe was responding. Do you remember what they were saying? You can't always make it out through the wall, but I heard it pretty clear last night. Derek was yelling something about food and rules. Phoebe answered him back. First time I ever heard her raise her voice, saying things like, "Stop controlling me," and "I'm not a child." Clark looked up from her notebook. Was that yesterday? What time was that, approximately? After 8 p.m., I was just having dinner and watching the news. It went on for about 10 minutes, then it got quiet again. And have you noticed anything unusual in their behavior lately? Tyrone stood up and walked over to the window overlooking Monroe's backyard. Derek had gotten even more picky. He'd seen him checking out Phoebe's car, looking in the glove compartment, checking the odometer. He also started walking her to and from work. He said it was safer, but it seemed weird. Did Phoebe have any reaction to this kind of scrutiny? Not at first. But in the last few weeks, she's been kind of, I don't know how to explain it, determined or something. She used to walk fast, head down, like she was in a hurry to hide. And the other day, I saw her talking to the mailman, laughing. The detectives thanked Tyrone and headed for the next house. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman on the right side, greeted them warily. "I haven't seen or heard anything," she said at once. "I try not to meddle in other people's affairs." But gradually, under the gentle pressure of questions, she began to tell. It turned out that Phoebe had sometimes come to her house for tea and conversation. She was a good girl, Mrs. Jenkins said as she poured the detective's coffee. Well-mannered, polite, but she always seemed intimidated, like she was afraid to say the wrong thing. Did she ever talk about family problems? Never complained directly, but she did say that Derek was very demanding. Everything at home had to be on a schedule. Breakfast at 7 a.m., dinner at 7:30 sharp. She wouldn't even go to the store without him. Had anything changed lately? The old woman was silent, stirring the sugar in her cup. 2 months ago, she came in all disheveled. Said she'd bought herself new shoes and Derek made her return them. Says she didn't ask permission to spend the money. I mean, she works. She earns her own money. Wilkes and Clark looked at each other. The picture was becoming clearer and clearer. Did Phoebe have any comment on her husband's demands? She used to justify them. She used to say that Derek was in the army, used to order, that the war had changed him, but lately, she's taken a different tack. She once said, "I'm not his soldier, I'm his wife." Next was the house across the street where the Williams family lived. The head of the household, Markel Williams, worked as a trucker and was often absent, but his wife Sarah proved to be an observant neighbor. They were always an odd couple, she said, rocking her 1-year-old baby in her arms. Phoebe followed her husband like a shadow, and he was always pulling her down. "You're talking loudly. You're standing the wrong way. You're looking the wrong way." "Have you seen any aggression from Derek?" "Not right in front of my eyes, but..." Sarah lowered her voice. "I saw him grab her arm in the yard and squeeze it really hard." Phoebe even cried out. Then he'd spent the next 5 minutes shouting at her, pointing his finger in her face. "When was this?" "About 3 weeks ago. They were discussing something outside the car, and then he got angry." Clark wrote down every detail. It was becoming clear that killing him over a burger was just the tip of the iceberg. "How's Phoebe been acting lately?" "She's been different. She used to never leave the house without Derek, but recently I saw her driving herself to the store, and she's been dressing brighter. Bought a red blouse, heels. Derek obviously didn't like that. They canvassed a few other neighbors. The picture was about the same everywhere. The Monroe family lived in isolation. Derek controlled his wife's every move, and in recent months, Phoebe had begun to show signs of independence. Old Robert Houston, who lived down the street, added another detail. "I saw this Derek in the store last week. He was buying something and he kept looking at his phone. And when I asked him how he was doing, he said he follows his wife on an app. He said he always knows where she is." By late afternoon, the detectives finished interviewing the neighbors and went back to the car. The sun was slipping toward the horizon, coloring the sky orange. A classic case of domestic violence, Clark summarized, flipping through the pages of her notebook. Control, isolation, psychological pressure, and now, murder. Wilkes nodded, starting the engine. Phoebe was beginning to resist his control, and he couldn't take it. The burger was just the last straw. I wonder what drove her to change, Clark wondered. 12 years of tolerance, and then suddenly she decided to stand up for her rights. We'll talk to her co-workers tomorrow, Wilkes said. Maybe they'll know more. The next morning, Wilkes and Clark began by reviewing Derek Monroe's file. In the archives of the military department found his documents. Served as a sergeant in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007 years. 2 tours of duty, medal for valor, wounded in the left leg from the explosion of an improvised device, discharged early for health reasons. Look at this. Clark pointed to a line in the medical records. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder at the military hospital. They recommended long-term therapy and psychiatric monitoring. Wilkes studied the commander's character references. Derek was described as a disciplined soldier, demanding of his subordinates, prone to excessive pedantry in following orders. One of the commanders noted that Sergeant Monroe was sometimes overly brutal when interrogating prisoners, but that was blamed on the stress of combat. Interesting, Wilkes said. It says here that he twice overstepped his authority when searching civilians. He was reprimanded, but never court-martialed. The file also says that Derek had trouble adjusting to civilian life after he was wounded. Psychiatrists recommended regular therapy sessions and medication, but he refused both forms of help. Detectives drove to the Veterans Administration, where they met with social worker Angela Davis. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes was going through Derek's file, shaking her head. Typical case, she said. He gets disability benefits for post-traumatic stress disorder, but he absolutely refuses treatment. We offered him group therapy, individual sessions, even special programs for combat veterans. His only answer to everything was that he could cope on his own. How often did you see him? Clark asked. Every 6 months for his recertification. The last time I saw him was in January. He seemed tense, irritable. He complained that his wife was disobeying him, that the house was out of order. I suggested couples therapy, but he just laughed. Did he say anything specific about his wife? Angela flipped through the notes in the folder. Yeah, there's an entry right here. He said literally the following. Phoebe has forgotten who's in charge of the house. She thinks she can do whatever she wants, but I'm going to teach her order. I was alarmed, and I even asked him if he was being forceful. He replied that he raised his wife the same way the Army raises soldiers. Wilkes wrote that sentence down verbatim. It explained a lot about Derek's behavior. Had he ever complained about marital problems before? Never. On the contrary, he always said his wife understood and supported him, that she was the only one helping him deal with the aftermath of the war. But this last time he was clearly agitated. Next stop, the warehouse of Central Supply, where Derek worked. The warehouse manager, Leonard Turner, met the detectives in his cramped office, littered with invoices and bills. Derek is a good worker, he said at once. Punctual, efficient, never late. But he's a little weird, to be honest. Strange in what way? Wilkes asked. Well, he does everything by the book. Even where a procedure could be simplified, he'll follow the instructions point by point, and he demands the same of others. Turner said Derek had been with them for 8 years, never took sick days or asked for time off. He came to work at 8 a.m. sharp and left at 6 p.m. sharp, not a minute earlier or later. How did he get along with his co-workers? Clark asked. It varied. Some people respect him for his reliability, but a lot of people think he's a bore. He's always reprimanding them. The crates are misaligned, the waybills aren't filled out neatly. It's like he's the boss, not just a loader. Turner led them into the warehouse, where the detectives talked to Derek's co-workers. Jonathan Hill, a young man of about 25, told a telling story. 2 months ago, I was 15 minutes late for work, car trouble. Derek was giving me a hard time, like he was my commanding officer. Said discipline was the foundation of everything. that if I couldn't manage my time, I didn't belong in the warehouse. Was that within his authority? Wilkes asked. Of course not. He's a worker like me, but he acts like we're all his subordinates. Another colleague, Vincent Rogers, added his observations. Derek is very pedantic. He has his own way of stacking merchandise, his own way of doing paperwork, and he gets angry if someone doesn't do things according to his system. He says he learned how to organize his work in the Army. And have you noticed any changes in his behavior lately? Yeah, he's gotten more irritable. He used to just make comments, but recently he's gotten really angry, yelling at Tommy for mixing up boxes, and last week he almost got into a fight with Carlos for putting the forklift in the wrong place. Vincent said another oddity was that Derek was always checking his phone while he was working. He said he was tracking his wife through a special app that showed her location. He attributed it to security. Vincent continued. It was a rough neighborhood, his wife was working late, so he needed to know where she was. But it looked like surveillance. Shift supervisor Robert Coleman added his observations. In recent months, Derek has become nervous. He used to do his job calmly, but recently he's been getting tense all the time, especially when he called home on his lunch hour. I remember one day, he called his wife and she didn't answer. He immediately started calling, getting angry, saying something about breaking the rules. What rules? Wilkes was interested. He said his wife should always return his calls, that they had a schedule at home and she had to follow it. I thought it was strange, a grown woman, but she lives like an Army regulation. Coleman also said that Derek had asked him several times to leave work early to follow his wife. He said he suspected her of something, but didn't specify what it was. How did he feel about criticism of himself? Clark asked. Not well, the shift supervisor answered honestly. He thought he knew how to do his job better than anyone else. If someone pointed out a mistake, he could get angry. Said he learned order in the Army, and we were just civilians who didn't understand anything. Detectives also learned that Derek repeatedly told co-workers about his military service. He always emphasized that he was a sergeant, that he commanded people, that he knew how to impose discipline. He returned to the topic especially often in recent months. I got the impression, Coleman said, that he missed the Army. There he had authority, subordinates, clear rules. Here he was just a loader and it depressed him. Before leaving the warehouse, the detectives talked to several other employees. They all noted one thing about Derek. He never admitted mistakes. If something went wrong, he always found someone to blame among his co-workers. He blamed the weigh bills that someone else had mishandled or the forklift that was supposedly malfunctioning. He lived in his own world, summarized one of the loaders. He thought he was always right in everything. And if reality didn't conform to his ideas, it was reality's fault, not his. After finishing up at the warehouse, the detectives drove to the Veterans Center where they had tried several times to treat Derek. The therapist, Michael Stone, agreed to meet with them, though he warned of doctor-patient confidentiality. I can only speak in general terms, he said. Derek came to see me 3 times in 2008 year, but then stopped treatment. Classic case of post-traumatic stress disorder with elements of obsessive-compulsive behavior. What does that mean for the average person? Clark asked. A need for tight control of the environment. A person tries to create a predictable world where everything obeys the rules. It's the psyche's protective response to trauma. Dr. Stone explained that many combat veterans experience similar problems, but most adapt to civilian life over time. Derek, on the other hand, refused help and withdrew into his world of rules and control. Flawless Dry Cleaners was located in an old shopping center on the outskirts of Blue Lake. The small room, with a storefront window littered with advertising posters, smelled of solvents and starch. Behind the counter stood a full, middle-aged woman with a tired face and attentive eyes. Are you here about Phoebe? She asked as soon as the detectives showed their IDs. I'm Rosalind Thompson, the manager. Terrible story. I can't believe this happened to her. Wilkes looked around. Behind the counter hung dozens of suits and dresses in plastic covers, and industrial washing machines lined the walls. There was an acrid odor of chemicals in the air that made his eyes sting. "Tell me about Phoebe as an employee," Clark asked, pulling out a notebook. "She's been with us for 4 years," Rosalind began, wiping her hands on her apron. "She was very diligent, never late, and the customers loved her. Polite, neat, always ready to help. Except that she was very quiet, didn't talk much about her personal life. And how did she get along with her co-workers? Okay, but she didn't get close to anyone. We're like a family around here. We have lunch together, talk about women's stuff." Phoebe always kept to herself. She'd answer politely when asked, but she never shared her problems. Rosalind led the detectives into a back room where 2 other women, Patricia White and Louise Jackson, were working. Both looked distraught at the news of their colleague's death. "Phoebe was a good person," said Patricia, a thin 40-year-old woman with gray strands in her hair. "But she was kind of intimidating, like she was always afraid of something." "Intimidated in what way?" Wilkes specified. "Well, for instance, if she made the slightest mistake in her work, she'd apologize as if she'd committed a crime. And she was always looking at her watch, afraid of being even a minute late home." Louise, a full-figured woman in her 50s with kind eyes, nodded in agreement. "Yes, and she always asked permission for the simplest things. Whether she could have coffee on her break, whether she could open a window if it was hot. We told her to do whatever you want. You're a grown woman." And she still asked. "Did Phoebe ever tell you anything about her husband?" Clark asked. Patricia and Louise looked at each other. It was obvious that they knew something important, but they were hesitant to say anything. "A little," Patricia finally said. "She mentioned that Derek was very demanding, that their house was very orderly, everything on a schedule. We thought he was just a meticulous man, lots of them." "Anything else?" "She never bought her lunch from a cafe, always brought it from home," Louise added. "She said Derek planned all the meals himself, bought the food, prepared the portions. Saves money that way," she said. Rosalind walked over to Phoebe's locker, which hadn't been opened yet. "We can show her things if we need to for the investigation. I have the keys." The locker contained a change of shoes, a spare blouse, and a small cosmetic bag. Clark noticed the concealer, too thick for normal use. "Did Phoebe wear makeup at work?" "Rarely," Patricia answered. "But in recent months, she'd been wearing makeup. She said she wanted to look better. She'd also bought new shoes, nice, low heels. Did her husband approve of such purchases?" The women looked at each other again, and Louise decided to tell the truth. 2 months ago, she came to work upset. She said she'd bought a blouse without Derek's permission, and he'd made her return it to the store. Said she could only spend the money with his consent, even if it was her own paycheck. Wilkes wrote down every detail. The story was getting more and more disturbing. "Did you notice any bruises or other marks on Phoebe?" Patricia nodded, lowering her voice. "I saw bruises on her arms a few times. She explained that she'd fallen or hit a door. We believed her. She really was clumsy. But now I realize it could have been something else." "When was the last time you noticed bruises?" "About 3 weeks ago. There was a dark spot on her wrist, like she'd been squeezed hard. Phoebe said she'd caught herself on the doorknob." Rosalind remembered another episode. "In May, she came in with a scratch on her neck. Not a big one, but it was noticeable. She said the neighbor's cat had scratched it. But the neighbors never had a cat. I know for a fact I live on the same street." Detectives questioned colleagues about Phoebe's behavior in recent months. It turned out that the girl had indeed changed, but not in the way you might expect. "She's become more determined," Louise explained. "She used to accept any shift, even weekends. But recently she started refusing overtime, said she wanted more time to herself. That wasn't like her," Patricia added. "Phoebe was always willing to help, never objected to extra work. Suddenly she was saying no." Rosalind told a telling story. "Last month I asked her to stay for an hour. It was an urgent order. Previously, she would have agreed immediately, and then she said, 'I'm sorry, but I cannot. I have my own plans.' I was surprised. but I didn't insist. What were her plans? She said she wanted to go to the library. Can you imagine? A grown woman asking her boss for permission to go to the library after work. The detectives also learned that Phoebe had started to take an interest in unusual things. Louise saw her reading pamphlets about women's rights that were handed out outside the mall. She hid the pamphlets in her bag when she saw me looking, Louise said. Then she asked me if I knew that wives were entitled to their own bank accounts. The question struck me as odd. Phoebe didn't know about her rights? Apparently not. She was surprised to learn that she could use her paycheck without her husband's consent. We explained to her that this was normal for all families, but she shook her head. Patricia added another detail. She recently asked how to open a bank card that her husband can't control. We thought she wanted to surprise him for his birthday or something. Gradually, it became clear that Phoebe had been secretly breaking the rules her husband had set up in recent months, buying herself cosmetics that she hid at work, sometimes eating at cafes instead of the food she'd brought from home. Once she even bought a fashion magazine, even though Derek had forbidden her to read nonsense. She was becoming more lively, Rosalind observed. She used to work like a robot, silent, focused. But recently she began to sing sometimes, smiled at customers, even made a joke or two. But at the same time she looked tense, Louisa added. It was like she was always looking around, afraid someone would see her wrong behavior. Detectives asked if Phoebe had talked about her future plans. It turned out that she had mentioned several times wanting to take a hairdressing course. She said she always wanted to work with people, to make them beautiful, Patricia said. But her husband thinks that dry cleaning is a more suitable job for a married woman. What do you mean, suitable? Clark asked. Well, there aren't a lot of male customers here. Mostly women bring things in. And a barbershop is a place where you can meet strangers, make unwanted acquaintances. Rosalind recalled a conversation that took place shortly before Phoebe's death. She asked if it was difficult to find a job in another city. She said she sometimes thought about moving, changing her surroundings, but immediately added that they were just dreams. Did she look serious when she talked about moving? More like sad, like a person who dreams of the impossible. At the end of the conversation, colleagues told us about Phoebe's last day at work. She came in as usual, but she looked particularly pensive. She worked silently all day, Louise recalled. And before she left, she suddenly said, "Girls, do you ever feel like you're not living your own lives?" We didn't understand what she meant. She also said a strange phrase, Patricia added. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing piece by piece. Soon there will be nothing left of me." We thought she was tired, advised her to take a vacation. Leaving the dry cleaners, the detectives got a full picture of Phoebe Monroe's life. For 13 years, she had been a dutiful wife, fulfilling the whims of a controlling husband. But in recent months, something had changed. She had begun to realize that she was entitled to her own life, her own decisions, her own dreams. The interrogation room at the Blue Lake police station was small and stuffy. Bare walls, an iron table, 3 chairs, and a video camera in the corner under the ceiling. Derek Monroe sat upright with his arms folded on the table and waited calmly for the interrogation to begin. He wore an orange prison robe, but he held himself with a military bearing. Wilkes turned on the recorder and recited the date, time, and names of those present. Clark sat down across from the suspect with a notepad in hand. 2 days into the investigation, the detectives had a lot of questions for Derek. "Yesterday, you confessed to killing your wife," Wilkes began. "Today, we'd like to talk more about your relationship with Phoebe. Tell us how your family life was organized." Derek leaned back in his chair, but his posture remained unchanged. "We had order," he said in a steady voice. "Clear rules that kept the family running efficiently. I learned that in the Army. Without discipline, any system will fall apart." "Describe those rules in detail." "I'll start with the daily schedule. Wake up at 7:30 in the morning. Phoebe made breakfast. Oatmeal, toast, coffee. I'd leave for work at 7:15 sharp. She'd leave at 7:30. I would get home at 7:30 in the evening, she by 7. Dinner was served at 8:30. Clark wrote down every detail. Derek talked about family life like he was describing an army regulation. What if one of you was late? Tardiness was unacceptable without a good reason. If Phoebe was late for work, she had to let me know in advance. If I was late, I would warn her. What happened in the event of a schedule violation? Derek was silent for a moment, searching for words. I explained to Phoebe the importance of discipline. Sometimes I had to be stern to make her understand the seriousness of the situation. Strict in what way? It varied. I could withhold dinner, forbid her to watch TV, withhold money for personal expenses. In extreme cases, physical violence. Wilkes felt his jaw muscles tighten. Derek talked about wife beating as calmly as he talked about the weather. Tell me about the shopping rules. I planned all the family's expenses, made a grocery list for the week, bought them on Saturday morning. Phoebe could only spend money on purchases I'd pre-arranged. But she was working and getting a paycheck? Of course she did. But I'm better at financial planning. I keep track of all my income and expenses. Make sure I save money. Women tend to spend impulsively. Clark looked up from her notebook. And how did you enforce that rule? Phoebe had a bank card, but I knew the PIN number and checked her statements regularly. I also installed an app on her phone that showed where she was and what purchases she was making. Was Phoebe willing to be monitored like that? She objected at first, but I explained the logic behind the system, said it would avoid financial problems and build a strong family. I commanded a squad in the Army, and I know how to organize the effective work of a group of people. Derek told me about his family's other rules. Phoebe wasn't allowed to bring guests to the house without his consent. She had to report to him all phone conversations lasting more than 5 minutes. She wasn't allowed to buy clothes without his approval. Not even underwear? Clark clarified. Even underwear. I bought everything I needed and made sure it was practical and inexpensive. Phoebe tends to go for pretty but impractical things. What about food? Tell me more about that. Derek's face darkened slightly at the mention of food. That's been a major problem in the last few months. I've been planning all of our meals, what, when, and how much we eat. I've been buying groceries according to a strict list, preparing portions. Phoebe was supposed to eat what I made for her and no more. Why such strict rules with food? Controlling your diet is important for your health and your budget. I calculated calories, planned a varied menu, bought quality food. If everyone eats whatever they want, whenever they want, the family will become chaotic. Wilkes leaned forward. Derek, tell me specifically about yesterday. What happened with the burger? On my way to work this morning, I got a double bacon cheeseburger at the 5th Corner. This is my favorite diner, and this burger is my favorite meal. I was planning on eating it for dinner after work. Did you tell your wife about this? Of course I did. I put the burger in the fridge and clearly told Phoebe, "That's my dinner, don't touch it." She nodded as if she understood. And what happened when you got home? Derek clenched his fists on the table. For the first time in the entire conversation, there was emotion in his voice. I got home from work at 7:30. Tired, wanted to eat and rest. I went to the kitchen to get a burger, and it was gone. I see the wrapper in the trash can. How did that make you feel? Rage. Pure, uncontrollable rage. It wasn't just breaking the rules, it was disrespecting me as the head of the family. Did you talk to Phoebe? Of course I did. Asked her why she ate my burger. She said she was hungry at lunch and didn't want to wait till dinner. Said it like she was entitled to my food. Clark wrote down every word. The story was becoming more absurd and tragic at the same time. What was next? I tried to explain to her the seriousness of the situation. I told her that this wasn't just a burger, but a symbol of order in our house. That if she started breaking the food rules, she would then break all the other rules. How did Phoebe react to your explanation? For the first time in all the years of our marriage, she objected. Said she was tired of living by my rules, that she wanted to eat whenever she wanted and whatever she wanted, said I had no right to stop her. Derek made it sound like your wife had committed treason, and that's when you decided to kill her? Not right away. First, I tried to restore order with words. I explained that every family had to have a leader, that I made more money and had the right to make the rules. But she kept arguing. What exactly were you arguing about? Phoebe said that she works and earns money too, that she has the right to buy her own food and eat it whenever she wants. She said I was her husband, not her commanding officer, and I should treat her as an equal. Did that make you angry? It horrified me. I realized I was losing control of the situation, that the woman I loved and who was supposed to support me was rebelling against everything we'd built together. Wilkes shook his head. In Derek's mind, what they'd built together meant a system of his total control over his wife. When exactly did you make the decision to use the gun? When she told me she wouldn't ask my permission to shop anymore, that she would open her own bank account and manage her own money. That's when I realized she was completely out of control. So you went for the gun? I told her, if you don't want to live by the rules of this family, you won't live at all. Took the gun out of the bedroom closet and went back into the kitchen. Did Phoebe try to stop you? She got scared and started apologizing, said she wouldn't break the rules again, that she forgot about the burger by accident. But it was too late. Why was it too late? Because I saw the truth. Phoebe had changed, become a different person. The woman I married no longer existed, and this new Phoebe was the enemy of everything I believed in. Derek told me how he shot his wife in the head from 2 meters away. He did it in cold blood without hesitation. Then he sat in the living room, smoked a cigarette, and called the police. Do you regret what you did? Clark asked. I regret that it came to this. But there was no other way out. Phoebe ruined our family when she started breaking the rules. I just hastened the inevitable. The detective's office was silent as Wilkes sat at his desk, piled with folders and crime scene photos, and slowly pored over witness statements. Clark stood at the window, looking out at the gray sky over Blue Lake. In 3 days of investigation, they had put together a complete picture of the Monroe family's tragedy, and now they had to file all the paperwork to bring the case to the prosecutor's office. A classic case of first-degree murder, Wilkes said, setting aside the last of the interrogation reports. Premeditated, cold-blooded, extremely violent. The lawyer will try to play the post-traumatic stress disorder card, but it won't help. Clark nodded without looking away from the window. Her thoughts were far from the legal language. You know what strikes me the most? She said. Not that he killed her. It's how long she put up with it. 12 years of living in constant fear, under total control. And only in the last few months has she started to fight back. That's how the psychology of domestic violence works, Wilkes replied. The victim gradually gets used to the restrictions, begins to accept them as normal. Derek hadn't become a monster all at once. He'd been methodically breaking Phoebe year after year. Wilkes got up from the table and walked over to the board where pictures and diagrams were hung. In the center hung a portrait of Phoebe Monroe, a smiling woman with kind eyes who hadn't lived to be 37. It started with little things, he continued. At first, Derek just offered to help with budget planning. Then he insisted on shopping together. Then he convinced her that he knew better what she needed. And so little by little, step by step, he'd stripped her of all autonomy. Clark turned from the window. Her face reflected fatigue and bitterness. What had made her change? Why had she decided to rebel now? Maybe she had a lot on her mind, Wilkes suggested. Or she met someone who showed her a different life. Remember her coworkers said she was reading pamphlets about women's rights? Maybe that's where her epiphany began. There was a knock on the door. Captain Harris came in, an older man with a gray mustache and attentive eyes. How are things with Monroe? He asked. The DA's office is in a hurry with the papers. All done, Wilkes replied, pointing to a stack of folders. Murder in the first degree, motive established, evidence irrefutable. Self-confessed, witnesses are present. What about the defense? The defense attorney will play the insanity defense because of post-traumatic stress disorder, Clark suggested. But the forensics showed that Derek was fully aware of his actions. The captain nodded and picked up the folders. Good work. Just a shame we couldn't have prevented the tragedy. When the captain left, the detectives were left alone with their thoughts. Monroe's case was legally closed, but the emotional fallout would linger. Do you know how many of these Phoebes are living in our town right now? Clark asked. How many women put up with domestic tyrants afraid to make a change? Too many, Wilkes sighed, and most of them will never seek help. They'll put up with it until something irreparable happens. By the end of the day, Derek Monroe's case had gone to the DA's office, where he would be charged with first-degree murder. With aggravating circumstances, he was facing life in prison without parole. Wilkes was packing up, getting ready for the end of his shift. 48 years on the force had taught him not to take cases personally, but Phoebe Monroe's story had hit him particularly hard. You know what pisses me off the most? He said, as he buttoned his jacket. She was so close to freedom, beginning to realize her rights, gaining courage. A little more, she could have walked away from him. Maybe that's why he killed her, Clark suggested. He felt like he was losing control. Figured if he couldn't control her, no one could have her. They walked out of the station into the gray evening. The streets of Blue Lake looked ordinary. People hurrying home after work, lights on in the windows of houses, children playing somewhere. It was peaceful, but the detectives knew that behind many closed doors, dramas as bad as the Monroe family tragedy were playing out. New cases tomorrow, Clark said as she got into the car. New victims, new perpetrators. The wheel keeps turning. Yes, Wilkes agreed. But every case solved is at least a little justice. It's too late for Phoebe, but her story could save someone else's life. They went their separate ways, each to his own family, his own problems, his own life. The case of Derek and Phoebe Monroe was another entry in the long chronicle of human tragedy, but it was also a reminder of how thin the line is between order and tyranny, between love and control, between life and death. No one lived in house number 23 on Maple Street anymore. Neighbors occasionally saw the cars of relatives pulling up to it, picking up belongings. But the house remained empty, a silent monument to a broken family and lost love.